Well, it's all Inform's fault. I mean, both my presence here today, for which I thank them, and also the fact that I was led to investigate the extraordinary happenings in the 80s and 90s in this country. Because Eileen Barker, who's unfortunately not here, but is the founder of Inform, said to me, there's a funny sort of a conference going on in Cardiff and I don't have anybody to send there. Do you think you could go? And I said, well, yes, what do you mean funny? And she said, it's all about witchcraft, she said, and as you're an anthropologist, you ought to know about that sort of thing. So down I went to Cardiff, and it was indeed rather bizarre, because half the audience was vicars in collars, and the other half seemed to be child psychiatrists, and I thought, what a mixture. The two senior social workers from Nottingham who presented their made their presentation had a whole lot of children's drawings which they said showed that these children had been abused by a cult of Satanists who, while worshipping the devil, sexually abused these children, sometimes raped them, occasionally murdered babies, which they, I think, ate. And I thought to myself, shades of Africa, this is extraordinary. And so I was curious and went back to the Department of Health and said, would you ask me to find out about this? And they said, well, yes, because we don't know what to do. They didn't say that, of course they wouldn't say that. But that's what I read in what they did say. So I did a study, and it was most fascinating because this is a country that I was brought up to feel that I belonged to, although I was brought up in Africa. And so I did not expect witches and witchcraft and Satanism in this country. But as it was so long ago, I think I ought to remind some of you anyway what it consisted of. In the 1980s, the national newspapers began to carry these reports that secret rituals were being held, during which, as I told you, children were abused, sometimes killed, and murdered as sacrifices. And this involved both the practice of black magic and, at that stage that we're talking about, witchcraft, or it was worship of Satan. There was a sort of whiff of this black mass, if not the witches' Sabbath, about it. British television and radio programmes, national, local and weekly papers, they all carried stories linking the sexual abuse of children with the activities of these cultists. The extreme versions of this might assert an international conspiracy, especially when similar cases began to appear in New Zealand, Australia and Holland and other European countries, especially those where English was a very common second language. The allegations included assertions that a whole range of unspeakable acts were part of these rites, but nobody had ever seen it. That was also common. They were alleged to, these activities were supposed to be performed by people in robes and masks, though again nobody had ever seen them. And this was because, everyone believed, members of this group were very powerful people who were able to protect the group from the consequences of what they were doing. At one international conference, Diane Corr, who was the founder of a children's charity in England, expressed her belief that at least 4,000 children were being sacrificed every year in Great Britain alone. So you can see it alarmed everybody very much. Given this, it is very surprising, at least it was to me, that Philip Jenkins, who was the author of the first book about this curious phenomenon, wrote, and I quote, "Of the several panics outlined in this book, ritual abuse, which is another name for this satanic abuse or Satanism, is the one that can be said to have effectively ceased and to have been almost entirely discredited among media and policymakers. book, his book, was published in 1992, but the work ended, his research obviously ended in 1991 because he has no listed newspaper reports after that. While the greatest number of cases in England were reported in 1989 and 1990, there were still 10 new cases in 1991, which was when he wrote. So, when my report, which was on the extent and nature of organised and ritual abuse, we didn't mention the word Satan, not a nice word for bureaucrats. When it was published, the Department of Health read it, some of the people read some of it, and they took the terms ritual abuse or organised abuse from out of the information and advice that they gave to social workers. In effect, they were confirming the fact that Jenkins' views had prevailed, and this form of child abuse was no longer officially recognised. So it looked as though it had all stopped. And now we're finding, 25 years on, that there are still cases of ritual abuse being alleged, although true to the current concern, they're mostly historic cases, reported by adults to their therapists. Recently, a very nasty case came to court. It was referred to as the Hampstead case, but that was significantly different from the cases that I was investigating at the end of the 20th century. Interestingly, in this case, the Hampstead case, the judge had experience of other fantastic abuse claims earlier on, and there was no conviction. Now, the media are no longer interested because they've got other fish to fry. They are concerned with historic abuse, especially accusations against celebrities, and from time to time they have a child accused of witchcraft, which is another dramatic case that they can report. So we don't know, we have no newspaper material for the number of cases of where satanic abuse is being alleged, or indeed for how long it's been continued since my report was published in 1994. But we do know that it has not stopped. And this actually raises a question which is of academic interest, which I won't bore you with, and practical interest, which is much, in many ways, more important. In trying to explain the original outburst, I used a combination of several kinds of factors, roughly two kinds of factors. What you might call underlying social factors, beliefs, behaviour, ideas, that are part of being English and which appear in a variety of forms. And I'll come back to those. The other types of factors are provocative. They're provoking this sort of spread of allegations. These factors consist of ideas, like those of evangelicals, and of the people who spread them about. Now, if we look at the immediate factors, it is sufficiently clear, and there's enough evidence, to show that the concept of satanic abuse was spread to the UK from America, from the US. There were people who came from the US and addressed conferences. There were interviews, particularly one with a policewoman called Sandy Gallant, who was a Californian, as they called it, cult cop, because her interest was in cults, and particularly in satanic cults. And her interview was published very widely across the UK because, of course, she was telling everybody how Satanists were abusing children in American nursery schools. This and other interviews with American experts also had a general effect. So it started in America, and it started also with children, but also with a woman who is very famous in this field, whose name was Michelle. And the book is called Michelle Remembers. There's a copy of it outside. It is the story of a woman and her therapist, a woman who alleged she was abused, kept in a cage, and various other unpleasant things when she was about 5 years old. She was finally rescued by a vision of the Virgin Mary, which is not vouchsafed to many other survivors of ritual abuse. But never mind, Michelle was rescued, but by the time her book had circulated a little while, there were other books coming out, and they were circulated here as well. Some people became particularly possessed by these ideas, and they became what I would call campaigners. They set out to tell everybody else about this and to make sure that people understood that children were at risk not merely of domestic abuse, but of these cult-based satanic rituals. Some of them were evangelical Christians, and to begin with, and one of the facts about this panic, as it was called by some people, about the period in which there were all these allegations, was that it shifted, it changed as the time went by. But to begin with, a large number of the campaigners were like a woman called Maureen Davis, who was English and lived in Wales, were evangelicals. And Maureen Davis is typical, so I'll tell you a bit more about her. She was a member of the Reach Out Trust, which was an organisation of evangelicals specialising in giving information and in organising get-togethers, and was a central body for evangelicals. Not very extreme, but also rather firmly associated with the new rise of evangelical Christianity. But Maureen started her own organisation, the Beacon Foundation, fairly soon, and she became both a campaigner and an expert. She worked hard. I can tell you exactly, I was lucky to find the information. Between April 1989 and November 1992, her activities included 13 conferences at which she spoke, 11 lectures which she gave, 7 seminars which she addressed, 3 study groups, 6 miscellaneous meetings with police and social services whom she addressed, an article for a social work magazine called Community Care, and a visit to the US where she was filmed for a promotional video about satanic abuse. Others like her may well have been equally busy, and there were plenty of them. But not all of them were evangelical Christians, like Maureen. There were journalists, in particular B. Campbell, and social workers like Judith Dawson, as she was then, but she's now Judith Jones, and Christine Johnson, who were the 2 social workers who presented the extraordinary information that I had, which started me off. What they said and the articles they wrote were prominently displayed in the media, and some even more extraordinary stories appeared in many of the lesser newspapers. There was an amazing collection out there. I was thrilled to bits to see some more that I hadn't seen before. There was the vicar who took a goat to a satanic mass. No picture of the goat, unfortunately. Mentioning B. Campbell reminds me that I must say that one of the provocative features at this time was the media. They must have been having a boring time, which I don't really recall at the moment, but they've seized upon all this material with huge glee. B. Campbell herself was a link between the social workers who had cases and the press who publicised them. And she herself wrote no less than 4 articles in 1 year, And the social workers who were her collaborators, the Nottingham social workers, wrote too. You will be hearing later from Rosie Waterhouse, I'm sure she will agree with me, that the media feeding frenzy did encourage the allegations and the reporting of cases. A well-known journalist who, with his colleague David Hebditch, wrote a very interesting and thorough investigation of one notorious case, wrote a marvellous article for the journalist's newspaper. He started it, "The Satanic Industry, don't you just love it?" And then went on later, "Whichever way the story goes, you get a good mix of weird sex, drug-taking orgies, bizarre regalia, and ritual baby murder." And as he said, you can't help sell newspapers with that mix. There was a sort of contagious nature of these allegations. And this showed up in a map of cases which I got reports of and which I put on a map of England, and you could see that there were distinct clusters here and there, mostly focused on a very spectacular case like the Nottingham Rochdale case, or else the Rochdale case. And around this main case would be lots of other little allegations of much less dramatic cases. Campaigners and journalists, and also the alleged victims of satanic abuse in the past, actually wrote books too, which further spread the ideas. They seem to have done it twice. First, by telling what they thought had happened to them. Audrey Harper is a very good source of information if you want to know. She had a very spectacular period as a Satanist victim. But they also served, these books, as information for teenagers and young people who were trying to remember what they'd suffered. And the contamination of accounts that had occurred all the time could easily be seen if you took the trouble to look. So that there was a lot of cross-contamination between the people coming from America and what they said, the books that were written, the articles that were written, and indeed what people said. So that this was where the information came from. At the end of this whole period, I suppose, there had been another spectacular change which I can briefly go on to tell you about, and that was the way in which therapists took over from social workers and became the source of a good deal of information or allegations about cultic ritual abuse. Long periods of therapy, like long periods of interrogation, usually produced the sort of stories that were wanted. And whereas one child in Rochdale was subjected to 33 different interviews in which he was asked questions about ghosts, some of the patients of therapists were subjected to months and years of so-called therapy, which resulted in dramatic stories of suffering from Satanists. Valerie Sinison, who was an early and very steadfast campaigner for belief in satanic abuse, and still is, has several times been quoted recently that she has had patients who've been recently abused and taken on new patients. She also claimed that the cohort of patients that she had were quite different from the children I had studied in the cases of abuse of children, and therefore that was why I could say there was no evidence, but she knew there was evidence. Though she did say that if by some chance the evidence was not forthcoming, it would be because there was some particular means by which the Satanists managed to wipe it out. One of her colleagues once told me that although satanic rituals were held in deepest forests and woods where they couldn't be seen, the results of their sacrifices were evaporated in portable incinerators, because some of the members of this cult worked in crematoria, and they brought portable incinerators with them, which they ran off the battery of a car. It's true. Some of the stories had my eyes popping out. As you will know, and will be talked about later, the earliest alarms about ritual abuse involved neo-pagans in deep suspicions and prejudice. Wicca was considered to be the most likely suspect because after all they were witches, weren't they? However, the campaigns by the Pagan Federation and the work that they did managed to stop at least the most prolific use of the terms witches and pagans in the newspapers quite quickly. So we then used Satanists as the label for these people. I've been talking about the various features which were passing features. They came at a particular time, they were the result of particular features of the society at the time, but there are some underlying continuities which I think are very important because they haven't gone away, and they will not until upheavals and some hundreds of years, no doubt. Therefore, they concern concepts of evil. The English culture is a Christian one, even for people who are not Christian. And they have a very clear division between good and evil, and the two concepts are personified in God and the devil. This Christian view was established early on in Christianity, although it picked up on existing ideas of good and evil, as Norman Cohen, the historian, has shown. Now, the felt need to explain the sexual abuse of children and the damage that was done to them was a result of confronting what many people felt was great evil. And indeed, when I read the cases of the Broxton children, there were 60 box files full of material. I was horrified. These children were probably the third generation of abused children in that family, certainly the second generation. Their parents had been sexually abused as children, and probably their grandparents, and who knows how far back it had gone. Other mistreatment and abuse was equally common. So it was an enormity. How do you explain how people will do things like this? And many social workers were not used to this sort of thing, they were not trained to understand it, and they were confounded. But the notion of a satanic cult was an explanation which a lot of people could hang on to and understand what was going on through that. So it was a development from what is a constant in European culture, which is the notion of the existence of evil and the association of the devil with worship by witches and by cult members. So this continuity is accompanied by the idea of a conspiracy, a secret conspiracy of groups, which is found sometimes in secular forms, but mostly seems to concern heretics, Protestants, sects of breakaway sects from Christian groups, and other faiths. These are organizations dedicated to the destruction of society as we know it. They are secret and and controlling and powerful. This idea goes back even further than the Christian one of good and evil, and was later was first used as an accusation against Christians themselves. But it is a lasting one, and that is part of the culture and will go on being transformed in various ways as time goes on.
Inform is an independent charity based here at the London School of Economics, which aims to help people by providing information about minority religions that is as accurate and as balanced and as up-to-date as possible. This graph here shows the movements most inquired about in the period 1996 to 2016. So this is the religious traditions we get asked about, and this is separate from the specific groups we get asked about, such as Scientology, Unification Church, and so on. So you can see that we have separate categories for paganism, Wicca, witchcraft, esotericism, religious Satanism, and so on. And you see that the majority of questions we get about traditions are to do with Christianity, but the paganism comes up second. So it's interesting to consider why we get so many inquiries about general paganism rather than about pagan groups. And this is partly because our inquiries about paganism are quite different to those about other groups. So we get a lot more inquiries from prospective and current members who want to know what kind of information we have, just making contact with us, and also looking to connect with other pagans and pagan groups, and then we refer them on to the Pagan Federation. And also no individual pagan group in the UK has been particularly controversial. So despite the diversity recognised by pagans and by those in the know perhaps, these inquiries that show that some outsiders consider paganism to be a single community.
So, at Inform's founding in the late 1980s, what was the situation like in regards to satanic ritual abuse? There were moral panics. First of all, about cults in Britain anyway, the crazy Moonies and Hare Krishnas. The Satanists were also very much a group to be worried about. With regard to paganism, despite the fact that the Pagan Federation had been around for a long time and had done a lot of work in getting rid of some of the myths, there was still misinformation about paganism, absolutely, and this came to head in the satanic ritual abuse panics. And it became a moral panic. It was whipped up by misinformation and fear-mongering. There's no distinction made between Satanism, witchcraft, and paganism, let alone even about what was then referred to as the occult or other concepts. And it was an opportunity for some evangelical groups to take the limelight, especially the Reach Out Trust, which Jean has already referred to. For example, some of the material that the Reach Out Trust was putting out at the time, and by the way, which is in folders out on the table, their newsletters if you're interested, it was an evangelical Christian organization founded to reach out to people lost to cults and the occult, led at that time by Maureen Davies. And in material written in 1988, she claimed that many young people are being brainwashed into joining the occult. Brainwashing, of course, was a very popular metaphor at the time, another thing which Inform tried to counter through information. Maureen Davies at the time was writing in a newsletter of the Reach Out Trust that people are recruited through three ways: generational witchcraft or Satanism, the two of course are not defined or distinguished, recruitment programs, whatever that may mean, and involuntary processes, again this reference to a kind of brainwashing or mythical process. And of course goes on to describe what takes place in organized ritual abuse and the dates when these are most likely to occur, which of course were the 8 festivals of the pagan year. So in the late 1980s, how did Inform counter these views at the time, aside of course from our secret weapon Jean, who you just heard. We tried to clarify and define all these concepts, and this has always been a major aspect of our work, kind of geeky in that way. So let me elaborate. Here you see a very retro version of one of our leaflets from the late 80s, early 90s, where it focused on the occult, paganism, and witchcraft, which is essentially Inform saying, okay, let's try and get this straight. To try and dispel the myths and say this is what these terms mean. Of course, if you look at our leaflets now, first of all, we don't use the term occult, we don't lump these together, but at that time, that is kind of what was needed, because people saw all this as one big mash of, well, these are all kind of ritual, weird things. Now our leaflets, luckily, have gotten beyond debunking, and we can go into specific traditions. So if you look at the leaflets now, it turns out we can go into Druidry, the Northern tradition, Wicca, etc. But at the time, this is kind of the level that we're working with. And then, of course, you know, if we're looking at our work right now, inquiries about witchcraft have changed, which is what Jean was referring to earlier. Now, this is often used in our work to categorize inquiries which concern non-indigenous traditional witchcraft beliefs, also very often conflated or in some cases combined with possession beliefs. So the thing is, the work still continues, it's ongoing. So you might ask, well, still now, how does this relate to paganism? Which is a good question. If we lump together all the categories of in our reality in form, what has been conflated with paganism, then we can see that this has kept inform very busy. This is a chunk. If we put together pagan, witchcraft, Satanism, esoteric groups, and possession beliefs, that's 36% of our thematic inquiries. And this is not even the media and the Daily Mail who call us and say, tell us about Scientology, or tell us about the Moonies or Hare Krishnas, which takes up a lot of space. These are just the religious traditions. These are what the interfaith network would consider, you know, the main 9 traditions up here. You know, oh, and this one, of course. But, you know, not that one until recently. So there is still a fusion of the terms witchcraft, paganism, Satanism, and now also witchcraft, which includes possession beliefs, that, you know, a lot of people, and very often still the media, don't really keep very categorized. So let's get back now to the timeline, because we started with a historical overview. The early 90s, once, as Jean said, you know, the Pagan Federation and some other organizations kind of dispelled, listen, it's not all satanic. Then there was a kind of a new scare. There was a critical focus that was turned to Halloween. Counter-cult and Christian groups like the Reach Out Trust and Jack Chick publications in the United States, for example, turned their attention to Halloween as a portal. A way for young people to get involved in Satanism and witchcraft, again, lumped together. Early 90s, the Reach Out Trust tried to distance itself from work on Satanism, and some media reports at that time were beginning to point the finger of blame at Maureen Davies for ripping up a moral panic. In 91, for instance, Doug Harris, who is then leading the trust, complained to the Press Complaints Commission about 2 newspaper articles which linked Reach Out to advice on satanic ritual abuse, and the complaint was not upheld, as until 1990 it was publicly stated that this was the focus of the Reach Out Trust. And I think we probably have that newsletter. And in 1990, there was a campaign by the Home Mission Committee, Christian Information Outreach, and the Evangelical Alliance, who produced videos and leaflets to be circulated in schools. Here's a scan of one of these leaflets, and we have a copy out on the table, focusing on the spiritual dangers to children when they celebrate Halloween. And I quote here, "There are those who, to satisfy a lust for corrupting the innocent, will actively seek to cooperate with evil spirits through Halloween, which has particular dangers for young children." In this campaign, also, churches plan to hold services for young people on Halloween as a Christian alternative. So at the time, especially in the media, around Halloween, there was a lot of media articles linking Halloween with dangerous evil practices and satanic worship. So over time, there was a changing media portrayal of Halloween, and throughout the 1990s there was a gradual move towards more positive media portrayal of Halloween, and a realization that this was a serious pagan festival and was not necessarily dangerous.
Okay, so to take you back into the 1990s, another kind of media focus that came to light at that time, which also had earlier antecedents, was this idea of attacks on horses being linked to paganism and Satanism, and again the two became conflated. Such as this Daily Mail article from 1993 with the headline, "The Pagan Trail Leading to a Shocking Crime," even though there's nothing about paganism in the article, and the DI in charge said some of the attacks happened on full moon, but there's no credible link there. But the article goes on to interview a Satanism expert from America who said that blood is taken from horses for use in ritual, that the attacks occur on a full moon, and that if there is a full moon and horses haven't been attacked, then young people must have gone missing because people have moved on to other targets. So that during the 1990s we did get inquiries about horse attacks and about other forms of what was considered to be harm to animals connected with rituals, such as a mass burial of rats. And we also had inquiries from the public who had seen what they assumed to be pagan rituals taking place in outside spaces, which might have been Christina, and which could well have been, and Inform had to stress that there was nothing inherently problematic with this. And of course we used the Pagan Federation at this point as well for information and contact. And we can't dismiss that some individuals might perpetrate such horrific acts for their own reasons, creating a ritual scene of some kind. But these stories of horse attacks and their allegedly pagan basis have continued into the 2000s, with headlines such as "Horse attacks may be witchcraft" and "Attacks on horses linked to satanic rituals." Other things that happened in the 1990s was a great deal of tabloid sensationalism, such as this 1991 News of the World article, "Kids at Naked Witch Ritual." And then there was a public opinion poll to ask whether the paper had been right to publish this story. And they later claimed that Pagans, including the PF, had sought to sabotage this poll by repeatedly voting no.
I think we did.
Fair enough.
But at the same time, the tabloids were happy to publish these stories about spells for good luck, which you can see in the middle here, good fortune, better finances, and love life, such as this 1992 article, which it could be argued was trivialising paganism.
So this is the story of my investigation, and I'm afraid my copy of Kids Forced into Satan Orgies was cut off a bit, but this is what really kicked off the scare in the media. Was this press conference, that the annual report of the NSPCC in March 1990, it was a Monday. I was working on the Independent on Sunday. Journalists don't work on a Monday for a Sunday paper. So I was not at this press conference. What we saw the next day were these amazing headlines. Here we are, media frenzy. NSPCC, this it was not in the actual annual report, it was in a briefing document. The NSPCC every year found something really high profile to shock, get headlines, hence money, and they're still doing it, obviously. Come back to them later, but those are some of the headlines which were quite extraordinary. So imagine, the Daily Mirror had the most extraordinary claims. They actually got hold of the notes that their reporter did, which was not actually referred to in the actual press conference, but it talked about children being made to eat part of a human heart, a baby in a microwave oven, another in a deep freeze, 20 children at a time in orgies where blood and urine were drunk, animals tortured and killed. This is national front page news. So imagine on a Sunday newspaper, Tuesday conference, what should we be looking at this week? So obviously this was a big topic. What on earth's going on? And I had recently joined the Independent on Sunday, having come from the Sunday Times, so I had a reputation for doing investigative work. And so my job was to, for the next Sunday's paper, spend that week, find out anything you can about what's the evidence for all this. So I kind of thought, okay, where would you find evidence? And somehow I came up with the idea, well, perhaps there have been criminal cases where this phrase has been used, or family court cases. And as it happens, then you've got to remember that 1990, this is before the internet, it's before mobile phones. But what there was an archive of newspaper cuttings called LexisNexis. And so what I did, I was about to say I Googled, well I didn't Google, I searched with using inverted commas, phrases like satanic abuse, criminal cases, court, barrister, and so on. And lo and behold, 5 newspaper criminal cases in which anecdotal claims of satanic ritual abuse were alleged. And then I thought about wardship cases, and quite bizarrely, and I know Jean had connection with the official solicitor's office. The official solicitor represents children in family wardship cases. And I just wondered, given that the stories that the NSPCC were talking about were about involving children, maybe this has already cropped up. in the family courts, and I got in touch with the press office of the official solicitor, and I thought I struck gold, because I said, have your solicitors ever come across any referrals to this? And he said, well, funnily enough, they have. I've started a file. Again, so this is what I found here. Official solicitor reported allegations of satanic ritual abuse had emerged in 14 wardship cases involving 41 children taken into care. And I thought, wow, this is it. This is evidence. And however, well, you'll see the next story that I was very pleased with myself to produce, in collaboration with some other colleagues. Mine was what's the evidence. So yeah, I'll come back to why I realised that anecdotal evidence is not the same as physical, forensic, corroborating evidence. Anyway, so we published. Oh, I was so proud of that piece. Until I kind of looked at some of the connotations of satanic litany of children suffering. Right, okay. Well, that was a bit over the top. Evidence of evil, the paragraph there, sorry. That's where I refer to these cases, the criminal cases, the family court cases, thinking that, this is proper journalism. And then, the Reverend Kevin Logan, yes. Part of my investigation was, begin at the beginning and work back. Where has all this stuff come from? So I go and have a briefing with the NSPCC, who put me in touch with the Evangelical Alliance, who put me in touch with Kevin Logan. And I'm thinking, right, I'm really on the case here. And in interviewing Kevin Logan, he was somehow on record as having corroborated the fact that teenage girls were being used as brood mares, impregnated, the fetus aborted for sacrifice. And he was claiming that he'd encountered these poor girls. So in my telephone interview with him, which fortunately I tape recorded, as a sort of a memoir more than anything. Anyway, so I remember asking the direct question, how many women have you spoken to directly that have told you that they were used as a broodmare, impregnated, fetus aborted, children for sacrifice? 8. And I thought, blimey, why would a vicar lie? I know, but this to me, I can't know what age I was quite young really, but relatively. But nevertheless, to me, I produced a really great piece of investigative journalism. I really am going to have to hurry up. Okay, so this led to a letter from the Pagan Federation. A letter in the post, no email. And also, at the same time, the Sorcerer's Apprentice and Fighting Fund, at that time, a bookshop in Leeds, it was known as the Sorcerer's Apprentice, it was also known as something else, something books, fantastic books or something. Anyway, together, or separately in fact, independently of each other, wrote to me to say, hey, hang on, what's the evidence? You really need to be more sceptical. And I was bombarded from then on. Certainly sent lots of information, factual information from the Pagan Federation, and I really was bombarded by Chris Bray from the Sorcerer's Apprentice with papers, documents, and he invited me to go and visit the bookshop. Now, I am really digressing, but it's so, to me, it's key and very interesting and funny, really, to recount that in the course of the next few weeks, we were in regular contact, and he invited me to go to the bookshop in Leeds to see their archives. They had been collecting, because of they were an occultist bookshop, they had a list of subscribers, of people internationally who bought the books. And they were writing in to Chris to say, hey, this is from about 1988, their archive, from people, from subscribers, occultists, saying this story's broken here, that story's broken there, sending in newspaper cuttings, And so he invited me up to the bookshop, and I suddenly felt a bit nervous, really. You know, I'd never knowingly met an occultist before, didn't really know what one was. But I thought, no, okay. So we went to see the archive. I actually was quite nervous, I really was. It was, well, from my memory, but it may be wrong, somebody else recalls the shop being yellow. I recall it being black from all on the outside.
Two shops.
That might explain it. Well, anyway, the one I went to was black, and I was scared, actually. I really did think, what am I getting into here? Anyway, the upshot was fantastic archival resource of newspaper cuttings, etc. And that the following week after my amazing evidence of evil, the editor of the Sunday Review, which was a fantastic showcase for journalism at the time, his father was a vicar, and what Richard, the editor, said, we're really intrigued, we want to know more about this. Look into it properly, really trace it back to source, everything. So with a combination of the material I was being sent, especially by the Pagan Federation, and I think it was Prudence, actually. I think the letter, I can't find it, but I think it was Prudence. So yes, I was tasked with investigating what's the evidence, and 5 months later, it wasn't the only story I worked on, I was working on other things, but I became obsessed with this and traced it all, you know, back to source, who said what, put in touch with Jean, who put me in touch with Cheryl Mulhern, who's actually, she's the author of the phrase, no bodies, no bones, no bloodstains, nothing. And I filched it, and it's a wonderful sort of cutout. The making of a satanic myth. I think that's probably one of my finest moments.
Can we just say thank you? Thank you.
But you know, it's to me now. I mean, it is now. I will move on. But that was a revelation to me, and there were people that I spoke to who for instance, in America where it did all begin. Let's see where have I got that. Oh yeah, it set me off on a whole load of further stories.
It's been quite strange actually, revisiting this after 25 years. It feels just like yesterday, to be honest, but then when I look deeper I find I can't remember the specific details. So I've spent 2 or 3 days trawling through boxes of documents I probably shouldn't still have hold of, but fortunately I did. So there are certain details about those years from about 1987 through to about 94, when the Satanic panic hit the headlines. Now, the Pagan Federation was founded as a campaigning organization, the Pagan Front. It was founded to lobby the establishment in order to make it sure that pagans, and at that time in 1971, particularly witches, because witches and pagans were more or less the same then, were treated like any other religion and had the right to worship and to practice their rites just as any other religion would. So it started as a campaigning organization, it continued as a campaigning organization. So when these headlights suddenly came on, we were in perhaps as good a position as anyone to know what to do about them. Nevertheless, looking back at the Witchen, our in-house newsletter for 1987, I see a really relaxed attitude to anti-defamation. 4 years earlier, the great Stonehenge debacle over the rights of Druids and ordinary pagans to celebrate the solstice at the Stones had actually brought paganism into the public eye. And it had given the Pagan Federation the gratifying experience of effective pro-pagan campaigning, because we all turned up in our best suits and all the rest of it to talk to English heritage about the rights of worship and Universal Declaration of Human Rights and all this kind of stuff. And we actually won limited access to the Stones, which was quite reasonable considering the numbers of thousands of people who did want to be there all at the same time. A certain amount of limitation seemed a reasonable sort of bartering tactic. So flushed with that success, we kind of settled, comparative success, we settled down into a rather lazy few years. And so reading The Witch and Four in 1997, we were girding up for battle against the Evangelical Alliance and its offshoot, the Association of Christian Teachers, which was planning to campaign against Halloween celebrations that autumn, but we were confident about the general drift of public awareness. And then came 1988. On 30th of March, a TV programme, Lucifer Over Lancashire, was fronted by our old friend the Reverend Kevin Logan, alleging all kinds of nonsense about occult-related crime involving Satanists and pagans in Lancashire. And then in April, a Conservative MP, Geoffrey Dickens, who, again, himself was a bit of a joke in the House of Commons, but, you know, as we've seen recently, jokes sometimes prevail, sometimes get taken seriously, claimed to have a dossier proving the existence of a ring of Satanic or occult or Wiccan paedophiles and child murderers who were menacing the health of the nation's children. And he proposed legislating to make witchcraft illegal once again. It had been accidentally, as it were, legalized in 1951 when the Witchcraft Act was replaced by the Fraudulent Mediums Act. This wasn't actually making witchcraft legal, it was failing to legislate against it because nobody believed in this stuff anymore. Anyway, Dickens was looking a bit more serious. So now establishment figures, as well as the usual sensation-seeking media trying to sell their papers, had got involved in this, and we needed to do something about it. We knew from our American contacts that satanic murder scares were becoming more common and involving witches and pagans, but we knew that it was important to nip such things in the bud, right? So that was the next year's 1988 Samhain cover, Witch Hunters at it again, saying, and we've got to stop this. Independently of these developments, the Pagan Fed was in the process of reorganizing itself. It had been one woman and her coven. It was in the process of developing a committee with committee roles, responsibilities, a secretary breathing down our necks saying, have you done this and that, which was a very good thing, and a new editor for the journal, the typesetter. The person who typeset this was a professional journalist on the Daily Telegraph, one of our members. So we were getting very organized, and the minutes of those early meetings show us writing to Geoffrey Dickens, writing to the Home Secretary, writing to the Speaker of the House, and to Diane Core of Child Watch, whom you've heard about. And in the autumn, I have the payment slips from the BBC showing that I debated with a Christian fundamentalist on the BBC World Service, and then again with someone else on BBC External Services. This one might have been TV. In those days, the media had lots of money and liked to dish it out for talk shows and so on. So we put ourselves around in this respect. It was a good old battle, and we enjoyed it very much. Other pagans too realised what was happening, and partly because of the low profile of the Pagan Federation since the Stonehenge debacle, another body had set itself up, the Pagan Council of Elders, with almost the same remit as the Pagan Federation. Whoops. Well, we collaborated. This is the pagan way. We liaised furiously, and actually that collaboration did lead to the first Pagan Fed conference in 1989, but I'll tell you about that a little bit later. And then in '88, Chris Bray, the Sorcerer's Apprentice, about whom you've heard, also got in touch. And we really saw eye to eye on this. He, like me, knew it was serious, knew it had to be put down very firmly, and the faster we got on with this, the better. If you let the enemy make the momentum, it's a lot harder to stop them. Get in there first. So Chris Bray really went at this hell for leather. and published lots of stuff, and also used his financial power to challenge some people in court. And he made the Reach Out Trust back down about some of their allegations later on. So good for Chris. Right. Well, 1989 then came round, and the Reach Out Trust with Maureen Davis, again as you've heard, seemed to be the main organisation involved in this. Maureen Davis had made contact with the American proponents of this scare and had brought their teachings and their methods back to the UK. And through the Sorcerer's Apprentice and our American contacts, we knew that the fundamentalists there had begun to influence police and social work through their conferences and training seminars. Here's the Witches League for Public Awareness. Animal Rescue League duped. It was alleged that, again, witches and Satanists had been harming animals. Then on the 17th of July, Central TV showed the Cook Report, in which reporter Roger Cook slandered Chris Gray and the SA in particular as murderers and purveyors of dead bodies. I mean, could they have got away with this? Probably not. Anyway, but on August the 13th, the Ides of Hecate, I note, the Sorcerer's Apprentice was firebombed by an unknown arsonist. The person's never been caught. And on the 9th of September, the Pagan Fed conference with Pagan Council of Elders at the Leicester Link-Up was actually thrown out of its premises.
Pagan Link.
Pagan Link.
Wasn't the Pagan Council of Elders?
Was it Pagan Link? I'm sorry, I'm corrected. Yes, right. The Pagan Council of Elders perhaps had moved on, but Leicester Pagan Link, we were certainly involved with Leicester Pagan Link, and you actually hosted, you arranged the venue. So thrown out of the premises, clever operation by the Christians. They waited till it was all set up, speakers invited, premises hired, money committed, and then at the last minute, the day before, they move in. Serious moral concerns. Oh, there's probably going to be picketing. This is how they managed to stop the play Beshti in Birmingham, if you remember, with the stories about malfeasance in the Sikh community. The very last minute, the police were brought in because there would be trouble, so the organisers were advised to pull it off at vast expense and loss. Anyway, that's what was done to the conference. So, with the help of the Leicester Pagans, we migrated to a field in a village nearby and had a wonderful outdoor conference with fire walking and circle dancing, all kinds of things we couldn't possibly have done indoors. So, and meanwhile, Nigel Pennick and I stomped off to the local radio station and gave them some very good copy and gave them a furious interview, and again had an extremely good time. So this was fun because none of us personally had been targeted. It was still great fun. These attacks made us much more determined and more organised. The Pagan Federation continued its proactive information distributing campaign. The Sorcerer's Apprentice, again, likewise. You've heard about much of this. But we also counterattacked. Despite the unproven allegations against occultists and pagans, a quick search of the newspapers showed that almost every week there was a conviction, not an allegation, but a conviction of a Christian dignitary for sexual misdemeanors. So we collected some newspaper cuttings. And I had an amusing time on one TV show when I said, well, I'm very happy to discuss allegations of sexual abuse by pagans and occultists, but we'll have the second half of the show on the convictions of Christians. What? Convictions of Christians? Yeah, I'll just fax you through this. So a couple of pages of this to say this was not just allegations, these were found guilty. So the pagan abuse thing was quietly dropped on that show, and I just talked nicely about paganism. So some good fun, but still the newspapers were full of this stuff. And all this was happening in the days before the internet. And telephone calls, videos sent by people to one another, and letters were the order of the day. It was slow, slow, slow. But everything changed when Orkney arrived in October 1988. We have Orkney. The occult response to the Christian response to the occult was edited and produced by someone who went under the name of Peter Elliott. He was actually a computer programmer for one of the London banks. Remember, this was 1988, early days. He knew his way around computing. He had no particular interest in the occult or in paganism, but he had a profound sense of justice and a logically trained mind. His magazine systematically deconstructed the baseless claims made by the fundamentalists. Where's the evidence, right? And having access to data streaming, as it was then, and making frequent visits through his job to the USA, he was able to obtain and publish verbatim, with commentary, the articles produced by the fundamentalists, like, where's the evidence? Plus, more importantly, their refutations by police investigators, such as people we've heard of, Kenneth Lanning, Robert Hicks, Gordon Melton, or indeed sociologists such as the then Paris-based Dr. Cheryl Mulhern. I think Peter must have spent hours on the telephone to Cheryl. Again, she was giving excellent evidence of how the child witnesses had been coached by leading questions. So we had these two observations laying the groundwork for the refutation of all this. Is there any material evidence? There is no material evidence for any of this stuff. And are the children's allegations unprompted, or are they coached? Again, they were not coached. A third observation was to come along to complete them. Right. So, but it was in 1990 that actual pagans, as opposed to the fundies fantasies of pagans, were finally accused. Somebody might put me right here, but we weren't aware of actual pagans being targeted before then. On March the 30th, 1990, two pagans living in Hull faced police and social workers on their doorstep at dawn, following an anonymous accusation of child abuse. You know, just like the classic witch hunts, get your neighbours, the neighbours you don't like. So we stepped in immediately, loads of telephone calls to the accused. My goodness, did they need to unload? And to social workers and police with information sent by post, by fax, all the rest of it. And a Pagan Fed member, who was a retired schoolmaster, stepped in and testified to the bona fides of paganism on the accused's behalf, which was absolutely splendid. So a nerve-wracking time, but at the hearing in May, a little over a month later, it was thrown out with no case to answer. So we knew we could beat these things I cannot say on film, these people we don't like. We knew we could win, but it was going to be a long struggle. And this, 1990, was the year when the press finally took notice of our arguments, rather than simply using them as one side in a balanced but entertaining battle. And on the principle of replying to all allegations printed, we had aroused the interest of Rosie Waterhouse, from whom we've heard. And no doubt the record of our correspondence is deep in the Pagan Fed archive in Cornwall, but she reminds me that a letter from me at the PF urging her to be sceptical had an enormous influence on her inquiries. So with the Independent on Sunday, and also the Mirror on Sunday, publishing deconstructions of these claims, the tide of public opinion, of public information, very, very slowly began to turn. Again, the Pagan Fed was advising people. We actually overturned one chap's conviction for knife crime. He was carrying an athame, of course, wrapped in silk and all the rest of it. But the benighted magistrates in that particular bit of the provinces had to be told that it was okay for ritual use. which we successfully did. So he was cleared on appeal. These things have to be cleared on a case-by-case basis. I think our legal friends will concur. And by the autumn of 1990, Doug Harris at the Reach Out Trust had let go of Maureen Davis, the prime mover in this. It announced that Maureen Davis had left Reach Out and was setting up her own trust to concentrate on ritual abuse. So, but of course it wasn't over yet. Many more cases were still to come. And the final thing I'll talk about briefly then is the Orkney case. 1991, the Orkney case came to the headlines. It had rumbled on from 1987, 1990, various bits of background to this. But in February, at the end of February, 4 families, incomers to the island of Sandy?
South Ronaldsay.
South Ronaldsay, thanks. Had their children snatched from them at dawn. Usual accusations. They were all, one family was Jewish, one Baptist, one Church of Scotland, one some other kind of Christian, but they were all incomers. And not, as far as I know, pagans. Anyway, these people were targeted by a zealous social worker, Liz McLean, who had been involved in the 1990 Rochdale case, which I haven't spoken about. But these people were not the dispossessed urban poor as in Rochdale and several of the other cases. Those had tended to be the people attacked. But these were educated, articulate, self-confident, middle-class people who had the will and also the money for counsel to employ an effective defence to get their children back. And this is where the third part of the deconstruction of satanic abuse came in, for us at the Pagan Federation anyway. In 1989, I'd met Ronald Hutton, and this was another story. He was just starting his research on the origins of Wicca. And as a quid pro quo, he kindly contributed an article to The Witch about the historic early modern witch trials and how that panic arose and the statistics. It included a book list, and looking through the journals, the magazine, I noticed that I've annotated the book list with the shelf numbers of those of the books in my local library. So I obviously went and read several of these at some point. So this may be, I think I already knew about it, but it may be when I came across Norman Cohen's book, Europe's Inner Demons, hence the title of this talk. And I've been hopping up and down for quite a long time before the Orkneys, saying, yeah, but this is archetypal stuff. It's classic moral panic. This is. However, not many of the people we were dealing with were in a position to or interested in hearing that particular argument. However, the Orkney parents took this one on board. So as well as giving the usual background information about the origin of this scare among American evangelicals and the demonstrably baseless nature of the accusations, I remember one of several telephone calls to a vicar's wife on the islands, either the actual vicar, Maurice Mackenzie, who'd been accused, or a colleague of his. I explained, people were absolutely devastated by this. And then I explained about the pattern of moral panic, and I almost heard the penny drop. This is a pattern. Bring in a sociologist. They will corroborate this. This is a classic pattern of moral panic. That's why there are these baseless accusations. That's why these children are coached by people who are so fervently do-gooding that they will do anything to get the right answer out of these poor victims. Here it is, and luckily, because of a late night minor channel TV chat show, I was able to put her in touch with someone at the University of Reading, as I remember. Again, I haven't got my notes, that I don't know who it was. But we had the contact with him. We could put the Orkney parents in touch with him, and the whole thing took off. The Orkney parents had to fight like everybody else, fighting it on a fact by fact by fact basis. But suddenly the bigger context was there. and the tide started to turn. I mean, I'm sure Rosie's articles as well were talking about moral panic and how this whole thing arose. But the tide really began to turn. At last, we'd found people who were willing and able to take this. Oh, could we have the final slide? In fact, the last but one. That's the one. This is fun. Orkney magazine was fun. It loved deconstructing this stuff, and this Shit Hits the Fan issue has reproductions of Rosie's articles in. But the next slide is that's, as I say, that was the pattern I was working on throughout this. There's no forensic evidence, as Lanning and the rest show. The child testimonies were coached, again, as the psychologists show. But meta theory, this is what happens in a moral panic.
There's a Chinese proverb that says, "May you live in interesting times." The period 1988 to 1991 was certainly an interesting time to be a pagan. Next slide, please. "We must wipe witchcraft from the face of the earth," says Geoffrey Dickens. Now, a key component, as we've heard tonight from the other speakers, in the satanic child abuse moral panic is a network of Christian spokespersons, largely Christians, Geoffrey Dickens MP, Dean Core and other representatives of the Reach Out Trust and the Reverend Kevin Logan, expressing concern at the rising visibility of pagans and occultists in British society. Now, I think what's sometimes forgotten when we reflect back on that period is that paganism and occultism was becoming more socially visible in British culture, and we're getting more organised. And sometimes when I hear pagans talking about that period now, it's like, oh, it was a dark time, you couldn't go out of your house because there were mobs of Christians roaming around with flaming torches, and you couldn't talk to other people in the pub because they might be a News of the World reporter with a microphone up their sleeve or somewhere else. And I want to just say, in many ways, it was a great time to be a pagan. There was a lot going on. And I think we should acknowledge this. Next slide, please. Now, pagans were becoming, for want of a better term, increasingly sociable, which led to, in turn, to an increased visibility. To give you some quick examples, there was a phase of reviving or starting up local moots, as they were known. Often half a dozen pagans crowded round a single glass of lemonade in a pub. Regional and national conferences. In 1988 alone, we had 4 regional Pagan Link organised conferences, a national Pagan Link conference at Leicester University, which was partly funded by a grant from Leicester County Council, no trouble whatsoever. Pagan and occult events taking place in public spaces. There was the Oxford Magical Art Exhibition, which took place in Oxford Library, which some people here may remember, and the 3rd National Symposium of Thelemic Magic, which took place at Oxford Town Hall. We had the first beginnings of pagan and occult themed courses being run at educational establishments. There was the Wakefield Women's Festival, which later got into the papers, held at Wakefield District College, which had some courses on the goddess and the wheel of the year. Of course, as the Christians picked up on this, there became evidence of satanic involvement. You know, we were using all of our many tentacles to reach into the world of the non-believer and draw them in with our sticky web of goddess worship, wheel of the year, tarot, you name it. And there was a growth in university and polytechnics, as existed then, pagan societies. Also, there was a kind of growth in pagan and occult zines and newsletters. Next slide, please. One of which was Northern Pagan Link News. Northern Pagan Link News was started by myself and Rodney Orpheus in March 1988 as a Pagan Link newsletter for the north of England. as you can see, we went for a kind of tabloid format. Dickens declares wars on witches. OTO implicated in sex and drug scandal. It's not hard to see where we were getting our inspiration from. We had the good fortune to start up just as all this stuff was kicking off. So I suppose in many ways we were grateful to the Christian fundamentalists because they gave us something to write about every month. Next slide, please. And in September 1988, having increased our circulation somewhat outside of the north, and widening our remit past reporting on mainly what Pagan Network was, well, what its latest argument was, we became Pagan News with a 30p price track, which some people complained about because they said, "Do you want to make a profit then?" I said, "Yeah, 30p is going to, you know, really pay for our penthouse and extreme lifestyles, isn't it?" And we managed to produce an issue roughly every 3 weeks until about the middle of 1990. Yeah, about the middle of 1990 when we became bi-monthly for a while, and then we kind of wound up in the middle of 1991 due to various issues. Revived briefly in 92, thanks largely to Caroline Wives, Steve Wilson and the Atlantis Bookshop, and carried on for a bit more before finally collapsing like a flan in the oven in the middle of 1993. Now, a little bit of our editorial stance. It was magic and occult and paganism, and yes, there were kind of like, well, big cracks between how people within the pagan and occult community saw themselves and related to each other. We decided we'd print anything. So, paganism, witchcraft, chaos magic, ceremonial magic, Kabbalah, people who channel little blue creatures from outer space. We covered it all. As regards to the satanic child abuse stuff, right from the outset we were extremely sceptical, and our stance, which we stuck to throughout our whole publishing period, was until some concrete evidence comes up, we're not going to believe it. Not all pagans actually agreed with that stance. We occasionally had angry letters, which we published, from people who said that, well, it must be happening. Obviously we're not doing it, but some other types of pagan are doing it, maybe Aleister Crowley worshippers or Thelemites, or the shadowy OTO, which was claimed at one point to have 10,000 members in the UK. we actually rang both the current heads of both types of OTO, both flavours if you like, and one responded with hysterical laughter and the other stunned silence at the idea that they had 10,000 members and were masterminding a secret takeover of the country. They wish. We'd actually come across the first kind of like Christian satanic child abuse stuff on Christian bulletin boards. Rodney and I were kind of internet hackers in the days before the internet. There was this phenomenon called bulletin boards. There were several Christian bulletin boards, and as we managed to penetrate their firewalls by means, arcane means I won't go into, we first started to read about the things like the indicators of satanic abuse. You know, your children is scared of forks, so that means Satan, you know, feeling them up, kind of stuff. And that was a big impulse for us in starting to get this stuff out. So yes, we reported on the representation of paganism and the occult in the mainstream media and on the major satanic child abuse cases. We were helped enormously by Chris Bray's work with the Sorcerer's Apprentice Fighting Fund, Peter Elliott, Prudence and the Pagan Federation, and lots of other people. And as I said, the pagan response to all this was varied. Some pagans and occultists kind of ignored it and hoped it would go away. Others, as I've said, believed it, but it wasn't their particular branch of pagans that were doing it. It was the kind of strange satanic people or the Crowley worshippers. And there were some white witches who were very keen to get in front of the microphone or a journalist's notepad and tell lurid stories about other branches of paganism. So they kind of allied themselves with the satanic child abuse claim makers. Next slide. Just give you some examples of our coverage again. We did a lot of coverage of Jeffrey Dickens's rantings. We covered the growth in the deconstruction, to use Prudence' word, of the satanic child abuse myths that started to come into the media. And we also know that the claim makers, Kevin Logan and Maureen Davis and co., made use of pagan news as a news source from which they could draw inspiration. For example, Kevin Logan, writing in a letter to the Independent on Sunday, again reiterating some of his concerns about the occult, cited an article in the August 89 issue of Pagan News by one Julian Vane on the subject of occult themes in children's fiction. Kevin claimed that this was a campaign to persuade children that the occult was best for them. And we were kind of like, wow, you know, we're a low circulation pagan fanzine, you know, and we're obviously masterminding this huge campaign. So thanks, Kevin. The check's in the post. Next slide. Just another example. This is one of our later issues. Some occult bookshops that were our regular stockists actually refused to stock this issue because of their kind of satanic montage. Get out of the way of it. It was even then in the middle of 1991, after we'd had several years of this stuff, that was still too strong an image for some pagans to bear. And again, we had some angry letters saying that we shouldn't have done such a provocative image. Next slide. So finally, to sum up, the satanic child abuse mythos, as we've heard tonight, is still around, still percolating, still bubbling under. Could it happen again? I'd like to think not. I think pagans and occultists are more visible. We've become more acceptable socially. To an extent, we've become normalised. And we're more media savvy. I think that's one of the biggest differences between then and now, is, yeah, there are a few people like Prudence and like Chris Bray who are very willing to get up in front of a microphone and argue our case. Unfortunately, a lot of pagans then were kind of more suspicious of the media, and I think that's changed now. We've got a lot of pagans who are more media friendly, more media savvy, who can explain what their particular path or spirituality is about without getting into long ums and ers and, oh well, you have to understand this bit and that bit, you know. We weren't very good at it back then. Thank you.